He was 61 years old the last time anyone watched him climb up out of that hole, and his hands would not stop shaking. It wasn't the cold. Men who spend 40 years underground don't shake from the cold. It was something he saw past the last beam, at the bottom of a shaft that 3 separate government agencies insist was never dug in the first place. His name was Emmett Rourke. And for the rest of his life, whenever anyone asked him what was down there, he would only ever say one thing. It wasn't ours. None of it was ever ours. Today, the tunnel he descended is sealed behind 11 feet of poured concrete and a chain-link fence, posted with warning signs from an agency that has no listed address and no phone number. The topographic maps of that stretch of the Grand Canyon show nothing. No entrance, no mining claim, no survey marker, not even a footpath. But the story Emmett Rourke told before he died, the ledger he smuggled out in the bottom of a battered lunch. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Pale, and the thing he found in the dark below that final beam, all of it points to something our history books were never built to explain. Because if Rourke was telling the truth, then the story of how money and power and civilization itself actually work has been buried under that canyon on purpose. So let's go down there with him, all the way down. To understand why a man like Rourke ended up at the bottom of the earth in the first place, you have to go back to the spring of 1909, to a newspaper most people have never heard of. On April 5th of that year, the Arizona Gazette ran a front-page story that would either become the most important archaeological discovery in American history, or vanish so completely that people would spend the next century arguing about whether it ever happened at all. The headline described an explorer named G.E. Kincaid, who claimed to have found an enormous underground citadel carved into the rock walls deep inside the Grand Canyon. Not a cave, a citadel. Miles of tunnels cut with machine precision, chambers stacked with copper artifacts, hieroglyphs that looked nothing like anything native to the Americas, and in the center of it all, a great crypt. The article said Kincaid was working under the direction of a Smithsonian archaeologist named Professor S.A. Jordan, and that a full expedition was already underway. It described mummified remains wrapped in a manner that resembled Egyptian burial. It described urns, tablets, and a system of passages so vast that Kincaid estimated 50,000 people could have lived inside. And then, almost as strangely as it appeared, the story died. No follow-up, no photographs, no artifacts placed in any museum. When researchers later contacted the Smithsonian, the institution said it had no record of a Kincaid, no record of a Professor Jordan, and no record of any expedition into the canyon at all. Now here is where most people stop. They call it a hoax, a slow news day, a bit of frontier entertainment, and they move on. But the people who don't move on tend to ask a very different question. Not, did it happen, but why does the official response go so far past a simple no? Because you don't need to erase two men's entire existence to deny a made-up story. You just say it never happened and let it fade. The scrubbing itself is the strange part, and Emmett Rourke spent the last 20 years of his life convinced he knew exactly why. And there's a detail here that most people skate right past. That old newspaper article didn't describe an American ruin. It described something that looked, in the reporter's own words, more like the work of the ancient East than anything that belonged in Arizona. Egyptian in its burial, Oriental in its symbols. Which lines up, uncomfortably well, with a much larger puzzle that historians would rather you didn't spend too long looking at. Because for roughly 300 years, from the 1500s into the 1700s, mapmakers across Europe drew an enormous empire spread across the top of the world, and they gave it a name. They called it Tartary, or Tartaria. It appears on official atlases, on globes made for kings, on documents produced by the most respected cartographers of their day, and then, within the span of a single century, it evaporates. The land stays, the borders get redrawn, The name is scrubbed out and replaced, and the whole idea of it is filed away as a vague misunderstanding, a label a few confused Europeans slapped onto a place they'd never really seen. Now you can believe that. Plenty of careful people do, and they have decent reasons. But it should at least give you pause that an empire the size of a continent can be printed on the maps of the most powerful nations on Earth for 300 years, and then be quietly declared to have never really been a thing at all. Empires don't usually get demoted to a clerical error. And the timing of that erasure is the part that kept Emmett Rourke up at night. Because the exact stretch of years when Tartaria was being wiped off the maps is the exact stretch of years when the world we live in now was being built. The banks, the debts, the rules. He came to believe those two facts were not a coincidence. He believed one was the cover for the other. And he believed the proof of it was sitting 1,000 feet under the Grand Canyon, which is the only reason a working miner from northern Arizona ended up tangled in the biggest question there is. Rourke wasn't a treasure hunter. He wasn't a believer in anything, at least not at first. He was a working miner out of a small town in northern Arizona, the kind of man who trusted his tools and distrusted almost everything else. In the early 1970s, he took a contract with a company he could never quite name, an outfit that paid in cash, asked no questions, and required every man on the crew to sign a document promising to never describe the work to anyone. The job was simple, they were told. Reinforce and extend an existing shaft, an old one. Older than the company, older than the state, older than anything the men had ever set eyes on. The entrance, Rourke said, was hidden, not remote. Hidden. You reached it through a natural fold in the canyon wall that you would walk past 1,000 times without noticing, and then through a steel door set flush into the rock, painted the exact color of the stone around it. Behind that door the tunnel went straight down at an angle no natural cave would ever take, lined at the top with timber the crew had installed themselves. But the deeper they dug, the stranger the walls became. Because somewhere around the 400-foot mark, the rough-cut stone the men were blasting through gave way to something none of them could explain. The walls turned smooth. Not smooth like water wears rock smooth over 10,000 years. Smooth like glass. Smooth like something had melted the stone and let it cool into a perfect, polished surface, and then someone had come along afterward and cut geometric channels into it with a precision no drill in that truck could match. And that was just the beginning. The company's response to the smooth walls told Rourke everything. The foreman didn't seem surprised. He seemed prepared. New instructions came down the same day. From that depth forward, the crew was to stop blasting and start clearing. Whatever was below them was not to be broken. It was to be uncovered. And the pay, which had already been good, suddenly doubled. Rourke said that was the first moment he understood. The men above him already knew what was down there. They weren't exploring. They were retrieving. The digging was just the cover story, the same way the newspaper article back in 1909 had been the cover story for something that was never meant to reach the public in the first place. Over the next several months, the crew cleared their way down through a section of shaft that should not have existed. They found the old beams first. Timber, ancient and black with age, but placed by human hands in a pattern that matched no mining technique any of them had studied. Someone had been down here before. Long before. And they had built supports the same way you or I might, except the wood had been treated with something that kept it from rotting across a span of time nobody could measure. Rourke counted the beams as they descended, the way a diver counts his breaths. Each one felt like a door. Each one felt like a warning. And every man on that crew felt the temperature doing something wrong. It should have gotten hotter the deeper they went. Instead, past a certain point, it got colder. Steadily, unmistakably colder, as if something below them was pulling the heat out of the earth. There was a younger man on the crew, a kid named Delroy, who couldn't have been more than 22, and Rourke would talk about him for the rest of his life. Delroy had good ears. He was the one who first noticed the sound. Down past the smooth walls, if all the men killed their equipment and stood perfectly still, you could hear something. Not water, not wind. A low, steady tone, almost too deep to catch, coming up from below the last beam, like the earth itself was holding a single held note. The kids swore it changed when you moved, that it followed you, The older men told him to knock it off, that a mind plays tricks, that a scared man hears his own blood. But Rourke heard it too, and he never once told the kid he was imagining it. He said the strangest part was that after a few days down there, you stop noticing the tone, the way you stop hearing a clock in your own house, and then you'd surface into the daylight, and the silence up top would feel wrong, too empty, like something had been switched off. Their lamps behaved strangely too, not failing, exactly, but down past the polished section the light didn't seem to travel the way it should. It fell short. You'd point a lamp down the cleared passage and the beam would simply stop at a certain distance, as if the dark down there had a thickness to it, a weight, something the light had to push through and mostly couldn't. The men joked about it to keep their nerve. Then they stopped joking, because the deeper they went, the less any of it felt like a joke. Now this is the part of the story where the economics come in, and I know that sounds strange when we're 1,000 feet underground in the dark. But stay with me, because this is the whole reason the shaft was sealed. Because when Rourke and 2 other men finally cleared the passage below the last beam, the deepest support timber in the entire shaft, they did not find a tomb. They found a room, a finished room. Walls of that same polished stone, a floor laid in a repeating geometric pattern, and along every surface, carved and inlaid and stamped into metal, the same recurring symbol, a sun. Not a sun the way a child draws one, a sun rendered as a machine. Rays that looked like circuitry, a center that looked like a mechanism, and beneath it, row after row after row of what could only be described as accounts, ledgers, cut into the walls. Columns and figures and marks of exchange running the entire length of the chamber. Whoever built this place had left behind their books. And their books were not written in a language, or at least not only in a language. They were written in a system of measurement, of value, of debt and credit and balance, laid out with the cold clarity of something that had been running for a very long time and expected to run for a great deal longer. Rourke was not an educated man, but he had kept a household ledger his whole life, and he said he knew an accounting when he saw one. This was an accounting. The question that would haunt him until the day he died was simple. Who were they keeping the books for? Here is what the revisionists, the ones who study the buried history nobody teaches, believe he stumbled into. They believe that long before the civilization we're told to remember, there existed another one. A network that some call by an old and disputed name, Tartaria, a word that appears on hundreds of genuine antique maps, and then quietly disappears from the record right around the time our modern economic order was being assembled. They believe this earlier world did not run on the system we run on now. It did not run on scarcity. It did not run on debt issued by private hands and rented back to everyone else at interest. Its architecture, all those star-shaped forts and impossible cathedrals and World's Fair palaces that were built in a year and demolished the next, suggests a civilization with access to power we can't replicate and wouldn't be allowed to. And its economy, if the revisionists are right, was built on abundance rather than lack. Think about what a ledger actually is for a second, because we handle them every day without noticing what they really represent. A ledger is memory made into power. It is the record of who is owed and who owes, and whoever controls that record controls the shape of everyone's life inside it. Change a number in the right book, and a man who was free this morning owes his labor to a stranger by nightfall, and it will all look perfectly legal, because the book says so. That is the quiet engine underneath every empire that has ever stood. Not the armies, the accounts. The armies are just there to protect the books. And here was a chamber, buried below the reach of anyone alive. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. Because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Whose entire purpose seemed to be the keeping of accounts on a scale and with a design that our own bookkeeping cannot match. What unsettled Rourke most, once he'd had years to turn it over, was the order of the thing. Chaos he could have dismissed. A pile of scratched symbols. He could have called superstition and walked away. But this was organized. Ruthlessly, beautifully organized. The columns aligned. The marks repeated in patterns that clearly meant something specific. There were what looked like totals and running balances, and cross-references from one section of wall to another, as if any entry could be checked against a dozen others. This was not the art of a lost tribe. This was the infrastructure of a functioning civilization, the boring, essential, load-bearing paperwork that only exists when a great many people are cooperating across a great deal of space and time. Somebody had run a world from this room, and somebody else had decided that world's books were dangerous enough to bury under a canyon and pour concrete over the only way in. That's the piece that gets a shaft filled with concrete, not the mummies, not the artifacts, the books. Because a ledger from a civilization that ran on abundance is not a curiosity, it's a blueprint. It's proof that the arrangement we're all born into, the one where you owe before you earn, where the money itself is borrowed into existence and can never quite be paid back, is not the only way a human world can be organized. It's a receipt from a system that worked without the chains. And there is nothing more dangerous to a house built on debt than a surviving receipt from a house that never needed any. Rourke didn't understand all of that at the bottom of the shaft. He was cold, he was frightened, and he was standing in a room that his own government would later swear did not exist. But he understood enough to do the one thing that saved this story from being sealed away with everything else. He stole a page. Not a stone page, he couldn't have carried that. In the corner of the chamber, laid flat in a shallow basin of that polished stone, was a stack of thin metal sheets, dark and flexible, each one covered edge to edge in the same accounting marks. He took one. He slid it into the bottom of his lunch pail under a folded rag, and he carried it up through 1,000 feet of shaft, past every beam, past the smooth walls, past the steel door painted the color of stone, and out into a canyon that looked exactly the way it had that morning, as if nothing underneath it had changed in 10,000 years. 3 days later, the company shut the whole operation down. They didn't announce it. They didn't explain it. The men showed up for their shift and found the entrance already being prepared for sealing. New crews they'd never seen were rigging the passage. The foreman handed out final envelopes of cash, thicker than any of them expected, along with a reminder of the paper each man had signed, and then a second document, one that hadn't been mentioned before. A statement, to be signed, affirming that the worksite had been an ordinary mineral survey and that nothing of historical or cultural significance had been encountered. Most of the men signed it. They had families. They had mortgages. They understood exactly what kind of trouble a person could invite by disagreeing with an organization that could make a shaft in a national park disappear off every map in a single afternoon. Rourke signed it too. But he signed it with the metal sheet already hidden at home, wrapped in oilcloth, buried under the floorboards of his own tool shed. For almost 20 years, he told no one. He watched. He read everything he could find about the 1,909 article, about the maps, about the strange gaps in the record where whole cities and whole peoples seemed to have been quietly written out. He noticed that the deeper he dug into the official history, the more it resembled the shaft itself, solid and ordinary near the surface, and then, past a certain depth, suddenly too smooth, too clean, too deliberately finished to be natural. And the more he read, the more the thing under his floorboards started to make a terrible kind of sense, because the marks on that metal sheet, once he stopped seeing them as decoration and started seeing them as bookkeeping, told a story. A civilization keeps ledgers for the same reason we do, to track who has what, who owes what, and who decides. And the astonishing thing about the accounting on Rourke's sheet, according to the few researchers he eventually trusted with it, was what was missing. There was no interest. Column after column of exchange, of goods moving and value shifting and balances resolving, and nowhere in any of it was there the compounding creep of a debt that grows on its own while you sleep. The numbers moved, but they moved between equals. Nobody in that system was quietly harvesting everybody else simply for holding the right to issue the tokens. It was an economy of ledgers without landlords. And if that sounds utopian, Remember that it also ended up 1,000 feet underground, sealed in the cold, covered over by a world that replaced it. Systems like that don't tend to lose fair fights. They tend to get buried. So what happened to them? This is where Rourke's story and the revisionist history braid together into something genuinely unsettling. The maps that show Tartaria don't just fade out. They get overwritten within a remarkably short window of history, the same window that gave us the modern banking system, the central issuance of currency, the idea that money is something a private institution lends into existence rather than something a people simply hold. It's the window historians call the birth of the modern economy. The revisionists call it something else. They call it the reset. A deliberate closing of the books on one world and the opening of new books on another, with different rules, different owners, and a carefully edited record explaining why the old way had never really existed at all. The mud that buried the lower floors of so many old buildings, the ones you can still see today with their original entrances a full story below the modern street, was, in this telling, not the slow settling of centuries. It was the debris of an ending. And the great citadel under the Grand Canyon, with its melted stone and its cold air and its walls full of honest accounts, was one of the last places the old world's records survived intact, precisely because it was already so deep that nobody could reach it to erase it, until someone with a company that pays in cash decided it was time to go down and retrieve them. Now, I want to be fair, because a good story does not need you to switch your brain off to enjoy it. There are people, serious people, who will tell you every piece of this has an ordinary explanation. The 1909 article, they'll say, was a common type of newspaper fiction from an era that ran plenty of it. The Tartaria on the old maps, they'll argue, was simply a broad and vague European label for a part of Asia they didn't understand well, not a hidden super-civilization. The buried lower floors of old buildings, they'll point out, are often just the result of cities raising their street levels over time, which is a real and documented thing. And they'll note correctly that a lot of what circulates about all of this comes from people selling a feeling rather than proving a fact, and that a story about buried ledgers under a canyon is exactly the kind of thing that spreads because it feels true, not because it has been shown to be. All of that is worth holding in your hand while you listen. A person can find the official story too clean and still keep their feet on the ground. But here's the friction, the part that keeps this from being an easy dismissal. Emmett Rourke was a real working man with a real employment history that has a hole in it. For a stretch of the early 1970s, the record of where he worked simply stops, and the company he named cannot be found in any registry that should have contained it. There are men, now very old, who worked that region in those years, and who go quiet in a particular way when you mention a sealed shaft above the river. And there is, sitting in a private collection to this day, a thin, dark metal sheet covered in an accounting system that no expert has been willing to put their name to on the record, because the moment you identify it, you have to explain where it came from. It is easier, always, to say a thing is nothing than to admit you cannot say what it is. Rourke tried, near the end of his life, to bring it into the open. He contacted researchers. He gave interviews to small outlets that most people never saw. He described the descent, the beams, the smooth walls, the cold, the room, the sun rendered as a machine, and the books that ran the length of the chamber. And every time, he came back to the same idea, the one that had grown in him for 2 decades under those floorboards, that the thing they had really been sent down to retrieve was not gold, and not artifacts, and not mummies. It was the proof. The physical, undeniable proof that the way we live now, the arrangement of debt and scarcity, and permanent quiet obligation that everyone treats as simply the nature of the world, is not the nature of anything. It is a choice that was made by someone at a specific moment and then dressed up as the only possibility that ever was. And the ledgers under the Grand Canyon were the last surviving evidence that other choices had once been made and had once worked by people who then vanished so thoroughly that we argue today about whether they were ever real. The one time he laid it all out for a researcher who took him seriously, the man later described the moment he first held the sheet. It was lighter than metal that thin had any right to be. It didn't tarnish. It didn't bend the way you'd expect and then stay bent. It flexed and returned, again and again, like it remembered its own shape. And under a strong light, the marks that covered it seemed to sit slightly below the surface rather than being scratched onto it, as though they had been grown into the material instead of carved. The researcher, who had spent his career around genuine antiquities, said the thing that stayed with him wasn't the mystery of what the marks meant. It was the certainty, the moment he held it, that this was not a fake. Fakes try to look old. This didn't try to look like anything. It simply was what it was, and what it was did not fit anywhere on the shelf of accepted history. And the crew, that's its own quiet horror. Of the men who went down that shaft, Rourke was the only one who ever spoke publicly, and he waited 20 years to do it. 2 of the others died within a decade, both in accidents, both alone. The kid, Delroy, the one with the good ears, simply dropped off the map. No death record Rourke could ever find, no forwarding address, nothing. Just a young man who heard a tone in the dark and was never heard from again. Rourke never claimed the company killed anyone. He was careful about that, always. He just noted, in the flat voice of a man stating a fact, that the people who could make a shaft vanish from every government map in an afternoon were not people who would find it especially difficult to make a handful of miners disappear along with it. He signed his paper. He kept his head down. And he outlived nearly everyone who could have confirmed a word he said, which is its own kind of loneliness. He died without convincing the world. Those who see too clearly often do. The shaft stayed sealed. The maps stayed blank. The Smithsonian stayed silent, as it had since 1909. And the metal sheet passed quietly from hand to hand among the small number of people who believe that the strangest thing about the official history is not what it tells us, but the specific, surgical care with which certain doors have been welded shut. So what do you do with a story like this? You don't have to believe every thread of it. You probably shouldn't. But there is one thing worth carrying up out of the dark with you, the same way Rourke carried that sheet up in his lunch pail. It is this. The systems we are born into always present themselves as permanent. The way money works, the way debt works, the way a handful of institutions get to decide what a life's labour is worth, all of it arrives wearing the mask of natural law, as ancient and unchangeable as the stone. And every so often, someone digs down past the surface, past the rough and ordinary rock, past the last beam anyone was ever supposed to reach, and finds the polished walls underneath, finds the seams, finds the accounts, finds the quiet, undeniable evidence that what looks like bedrock is actually construction, that someone built this, and that anything one group of people built, another group of people can question, can read, and can one day choose to build differently. That the floor beneath your feet, the one you were told was solid ground, was poured by hands at a time for a reason. And a floor that was poured can, in principle, be lifted. That is a frightening thought and a hopeful one at the same time, and Rourke carried both of them up out of the ground in equal measure, which is maybe why his hands never stopped shaking. That, in the end, is what Rourke found past the last beam. Not treasure, not aliens, a ledger. A set of books from a world that kept honest accounts, buried under a world that would rather you never learned to read them. He spent the rest of his life shaking, not because he was afraid of the dark, but because he had seen the light down there, cut into a wall in the shape of a machine, and he understood at last that the darkness we live in was put there on purpose. The canyon keeps its secret still, the concrete holds, but the sheet is real, the hole in his history is real, and the question he left behind is one no amount of poured concrete has ever managed to seal. If our world is the only one that ever worked, why did someone bury the receipts of the one that came before? He never got his answer. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the answer was always going to be somebody else's job to dig for. Maybe it's yours, and maybe that was, in the end, exactly how they intended it to stay.